The American radio operator keyed his handset for the third time in 15 minutes. His patrol commander wanted an update on their position. Standard procedure. The kind of routine check-in that happened thousands of times every day across Vietnam. Just another voice transmission on the AN/PRC-25. The radio general Crichton Abrams called the single most important tactical item in Vietnam. What the American didn't know was that 800 meters away, a Viet Cong signals intelligence team had been tracking his transmission since dawn. They had plotted his patrol's movement with precision. They knew exactly how many men he was traveling with based on the frequency of his broadcasts. They knew his commander's call sign. They knew where he was going. And they were preparing an ambush that would leave 11 Americans dead before sunset. 3 kilometers to the east, an Australian SAS patrol moved through the same jungle, 5 men, same mission, same equipment, same enemy territory. But their radio had been silent for 41 hours. Not broken, not malfunctioning. Silent by design, by doctrine, by a discipline so absolute that it bordered on religious conviction. And that silence was the reason all 5 of them would walk out alive while their American counterparts were being loaded into body bags. This is the story of the most counterintuitive survival doctrine of the Vietnam War, the rule that saved more Australian lives than body armor, superior firepower, or tactical brilliance ever could, the rule that American commanders dismissed as paranoid, impractical, and fundamentally incompatible with modern warfare, the rule that every Australian SAS operator learned before they ever set foot in the jungle. No radios after dark, and when you absolutely must transmit, you better have a damn good reason, because that transmission might be the last thing you ever do. The invisible enemy. In early 1965, American military planners made an assumption that would cost thousands of lives over the next decade. They assumed the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong were too primitive, too technologically backwards, too fundamentally incapable of sophisticated signals intelligence operations to pose any real threat to American radio communications. This assumption was catastrophic. What American commanders didn't know, or refused to believe, despite mounting evidence, was that the enemy had been building signals intelligence capabilities since the French Indochina War. By 1965, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces had established comprehensive radio intercept networks throughout South Vietnam. They possessed Soviet-made direction-finding equipment. They had trained operators who spoke excellent English. And most dangerously, they had developed tactical doctrines that weaponized every careless radio transmission against the forces that made them. The evidence was there from the beginning, ignored by senior leadership who couldn't conceive that an enemy they viewed as peasant guerrillas could master the technical complexities of signals intelligence. In November 1965, Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore led the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry into the Ia Drang Valley for what would become one of the bloodiest battles of the war. What Moore didn't know was that his landing zone, LZ X-ray, was occupied by a multi-battalion North Vietnamese force that included a dedicated radio intercept reconnaissance organization. Army Security Agency detachments monitored over 28,000 radio transmissions during the 3-day battle. The enemy monitoring effort revealed the exact location of the landing zone. They learned that there were only enough helicopters available to lift one company at a time. They discovered the precise timing of reinforcements, the locations of command posts, the call signs of key personnel. With that intelligence, enemy forces attacked each helicopter lift immediately upon landing. isolating platoon-sized units and inflicting massive casualties. 234 Americans died. Hundreds more were wounded. But Major General Harry Kinnard, commander of the 1st Cavalry Division, remained unconvinced. When presented with a report documenting over 11,000 communication security violations during his division's pre-deployment training, he dismissed the concerns. Even if the enemy could intercept American radio communications, he argued, even if they understood English well enough to comprehend the messages, American forces moved so rapidly and decisively that the intelligence would be outdated before it could be exploited. He was wrong. The enemy proved it again and again and again. The architecture of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong signals intelligence was far more sophisticated than American commanders imagined. By the mid-1960s, the enemy had established a comprehensive network of radio intercept stations throughout South Vietnam and along the demilitarized zone. These stations were manned by operators who had received extensive training in English comprehension and radio procedures. Some had been trained in China. Others had learned by simply monitoring American communications for months, building pattern recognition that allowed them to anticipate American operations before they were executed. The equipment varied in sophistication. Some stations used Soviet-made direction-finding gear that rivaled American technology. Others relied on Chinese-manufactured equipment that was primitive by Western standards, but perfectly adequate for tracking the powerful transmissions of American tactical radios. The most effective stations operated captured American equipment, including PRC-25 radios that had been stolen or recovered from battlefield losses. What unified this disparate collection of equipment and personnel was doctrine. North Vietnamese signals, intelligence operations were centrally coordinated through a system that funneled tactical intercepts up through regional commands and disseminated the intelligence back down to combat units within hours. This created a feedback loop that American commanders were slow to recognize and slower still to counter. An American battalion conducting a sweep operation might transmit routine position reports every 2 hours. Those transmissions would be intercepted by multiple enemy stations. The bearings would be plotted. The battalion's route of march would be predicted with reasonable accuracy. That intelligence would be passed to Viet Cong or North Vietnamese units in the area, and by the time the American battalion reached the predicted location, enemy forces would have ambush positions established, fields of fire cleared, and withdrawal routes prepared. The American response to contact followed predictable patterns that enemy forces learned to exploit. When an American patrol made contact, the radio operator would immediately begin transmitting position reports, casualty status, fire support requests. The transmissions would continue for minutes at a time, providing enemy direction-finding teams with multiple bearings that produced highly accurate position fixes. Enemy forces learned that American patrols in contact would call for artillery support within minutes. They learned the typical delay between a fire mission request and the first rounds impacting. They learned to position their ambush forces in locations that allowed rapid withdrawal before American firepower could be brought to bear effectively. They learned to attack, inflict casualties, and disengage before the American machine could grind into action. And they learned that American casualties generated even more predictable radio traffic. Medical evacuation requests followed standard formats. Helicopter landing zones would be established in predictable locations based on terrain and proximity to the casualties. Enemy forces could anticipate where those landing zones would be and prepare secondary ambushes to target the evacuation helicopters. The intelligence picture that enemy forces developed through radio intercepts was comprehensive. They knew unit designations. They knew commander call signs. They knew which American units had aggressive commanders who would pursue contact and which had cautious commanders who would call for fire support and withdraw. They knew which units maintained strict radio discipline and which transmitted freely. They knew which units could be baited into pursuing and which would refuse contact. This knowledge shaped enemy tactical decisions at every level. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces, operating in areas with heavy American presence, developed detailed intelligence files on every major American unit. These files included radio frequencies, call sign patterns, typical operational procedures, commander personalities, and tactical habits. Enemy battalion and regimental commanders used this intelligence to plan operations with a level of precision that American intelligence analysts found difficult to believe when they finally encountered the captured documents that proved it. By 1968, captured documents revealed that Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces had developed completely different tactical guidance for engaging American versus Australian forces. The guidance for Americans was detailed and confident. American units used helicopter insertions that could be heard from kilometers away. American patrols moved at trackable speeds. American soldiers could be detected by smell from 500 meters. Most critically, American radio procedures were predictable, excessive, and exploitable. The recommended approach for engaging Americans was aggressive ambush at carefully selected locations, inflicting maximum casualties in the first 30 seconds, then withdrawing through prepared routes before artillery could be brought to bear. The tactic worked because American radio communications had already revealed patrol routes, timings, and response procedures. The guidance for Australians was radically different. One captured document used a specific term that was applied to no other Allied force: rung, phantoms of the jungle. The recommendation was simple and telling: avoidance. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Do not attempt ambush, because Australian patrols were more likely to detect the trap before entering it. If contact was unavoidable, break it off as quickly as possible and withdraw to areas where Australian patrols were not operating. The enemy was afraid of the Australians in ways they were never afraid of Americans, and a significant reason was radio discipline. The doctrine of silence. When Australian SAS squadrons began rotating through Vietnam in 1966, they brought with them a communications doctrine that had been refined through decades of colonial policing, jungle warfare in Malaya and Borneo, and hard-learned lessons from operating in hostile territories where detection meant death. The doctrine was built on a single foundational principle: every radio transmission is a death sentence waiting to happen. The AN/PR C-25 radio that both American and Australian forces carried was a technological marvel for its time. Solid-state circuitry, water-resistant construction, simple operation, a 3-foot standard antenna that could extend to 10 feet for long-range communications. Weighing about 25 pounds with battery, it was the workhorse of combat communications, connecting infantry patrols with fire support, medical evacuation, and command elements. It was also a homing beacon for enemy direction-finding teams. When a PRC-25 transmitted, it broadcast a radio frequency signal that could be detected, tracked, and triangulated by enemy signals intelligence units. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong operated extensive networks of radio direction finding stations throughout South Vietnam. These stations, often equipped with Chinese-manufactured equipment or captured American gear, could pinpoint a transmitting radio's location to within 100 meters, sometimes closer. The technical process was straightforward. 3 or more direction-finding stations would simultaneously tune to the frequency of a target transmitter. When the target broadcast, each station would shoot a line of bearing indicating the direction from which the signal originated. These bearings would be plotted on a map. Where the lines intersected was the transmitter's location. The more a radio transmitted, the more precise the fix became. A single brief transmission might give the enemy a general area. Multiple transmissions over minutes or hours would narrow it down to a specific grid coordinate, and once the enemy had that coordinate, they could prepare ambushes, call in artillery, or maneuver forces to engage with overwhelming advantage. American forces operating under doctrines developed for conventional warfare against conventional enemies transmitted constantly. Routine position reports, equipment status updates, casual communications that filled empty radio time. Radio operators were trained to maintain regular contact with higher headquarters, to check in at scheduled intervals, to confirm receipt of orders, and relay information promptly. This approach made tactical sense in a conventional conflict where radio security was ensured through encrypted communication systems and where the enemy lacked sophisticated direction-finding capabilities. But Vietnam was not a conventional conflict, and despite warnings from the National Security Agency, despite mounting evidence of enemy intercept capabilities, despite after-action reports that clearly indicated communications were being exploited, American forces continued transmitting with a frequency and casualness that Australian observers found almost incomprehensible. The Australian approach was fundamentally different. It began with a simple rule that was drilled into every SAS operator from their first day of training. Silence is survival. The mathematics of Death Australian SAS radio doctrine in Vietnam operated on a tiered system of restrictions that became progressively more severe as threat levels increased. At base, in secured areas, radios operated normally. Communications were routine. But the moment a patrol crossed the wire and entered hostile territory, everything changed. During daylight hours, on patrol in enemy territory, radio communications were permitted but minimized to absolute operational necessity. There were no routine check-ins, no casual status updates, no transmissions unless the information being communicated was critical enough to justify the risk of detection. Patrol commanders were authorized to use their radios to report significant intelligence finds, to call for emergency medical evacuation, to coordinate with artillery and air support during contacts. But they exercised that authority with extreme reluctance. Every transmission was weighed against a simple calculation. Is this information worth potentially compromising our position? Is it worth risking the lives of 5 men? In most cases, the answer was no. The mathematics were brutal and unambiguous. A 30-second radio transmission could be detected by enemy direction-finding stations out to 15 kilometers or more, depending on terrain and atmospheric conditions. That transmission would give the enemy a rough bearing. A second transmission, even minutes later, would allow triangulation. A third would provide a precise fix. From the moment of that third transmission, the patrol was operating on borrowed time. Enemy forces could be maneuvering toward the compromised position within minutes. An ambush could be established along likely routes of movement within an hour. What had been a covert reconnaissance patrol had become a hunted element, surrounded by enemies who knew exactly where to look. American patrols, transmitting regularly throughout their operations, were essentially broadcasting their locations continuously. Enemy forces didn't need to search for them. They just needed to listen, plot the bearings, and set the trap. But the Australian doctrine's most controversial and counterintuitive element was the nighttime rule. From last light until first light, Australian SAS patrols went completely dark. No transmissions, no exceptions. The radio was essentially considered non-functional from dusk to dawn. This policy horrified American liaison officers when they first learned about it. What if a patrol made contact? What if they needed emergency fire support? What if they had critical intelligence that needed to be reported immediately? How could any commander justify denying his men access to artillery support, airstrikes, and medical evacuation during the most dangerous hours of the day? The Australian response was simple and uncompromising. Dead men don't need fire support. The night belonged to the enemy. Vietnamese forces, fighting in their own country, in jungles they knew intimately, with decades of experience in nocturnal operations, owned the darkness in ways that Allied forces never would. They moved through night jungle with confidence. They set ambushes. They conducted attacks. They listened. And they had learned that the best time to hunt American patrols was after sunset, when tired radio operators became careless, when routine communications occurred according to predictable schedules, when the darkness made visual observation impossible, and radio detection was the primary method of locating enemy forces. An American patrol that transmitted at night was essentially firing a flare into the sky and announcing its position to every enemy force within 15 kilometers. The transmission would be detected. The bearings would be plotted. Enemy forces would maneuver under cover of darkness. And by dawn, the patrol would be surrounded by an enemy that had spent all night preparing the perfect killing ground. Australian patrols that went radio silent at night denied the enemy their primary targeting method. They became invisible, undetectable, true ghosts in the darkness. Enemy direction-finding teams could sweep frequencies all night and find nothing. No bearings to plot, no positions to fix, no targets to engage. The cost of this discipline was significant. Australian patrols that made contact at night had to fight their way out with only the weapons and ammunition they carried. They couldn't call for artillery support until first light. They couldn't request medical evacuation until dawn. They had to rely entirely on their own tactical skills, their preparation, and their ability to break contact and evade pursuit in darkness. But the mathematics were undeniable. An Australian patrol that maintained radio silence at night had a survival rate that far exceeded American patrols that maintained regular communications. The enemy simply couldn't find them. And what the enemy couldn't find, the enemy couldn't kill. The price of discipline. The nighttime radio silence doctrine created situations that tested the limits of human endurance and challenged every instinct that soldiers develop about relying on support from higher command. In November 1968, a 5-man Australian SAS patrol operating deep in the Long High Mountains made contact with a Viet Cong force estimated at platoon strength just before sunset. The contact was brief, violent, and immediately broken by the Australians, who withdrew into dense jungle and established a defensive position approximately 400 meters from the contact site. One patrol member had been wounded, not critically, but seriously enough to require medical attention beyond what the patrol medic could provide in field conditions. Standard American procedure would have been immediate. Call for fire support to suppress the enemy. Request helicopter extraction. Get the wounded man to a field hospital within the hour. But the Australian patrol was operating under their doctrine's absolute restrictions. No transmissions after dark. The patrol commander faced an impossible choice. He could violate doctrine, key his radio, and call for medical evacuation. The wounded trooper would receive professional medical care. The patrol would likely be extracted safely, but that transmission would almost certainly compromise their position to enemy direction-finding teams. The Viet Cong force that had just made contact with them was searching for their location. One radio transmission would give it to them. The commander chose silence. For the next 11 hours, the patrol remained in position. The medic administered what care he could with the supplies available. The wounded trooper, understanding the tactical situation, did not request evacuation. The patrol maintained absolute noise discipline while enemy forces searched the area around them, sometimes passing within 20 meters of their concealed position. At first light, the patrol commander made a single brief transmission: grid coordinates, casualty report, request for medical evacuation. The transmission lasted less than 15 seconds. Within 30 minutes, helicopters were overhead. The wounded trooper was evacuated and survived his injuries. The patrol was extracted without further contact. The alternative scenario plays out in American after-action reports dozens of times. A patrol makes contact near nightfall. The radio operator immediately begins transmitting position reports, casualty status, fire support requests. The transmissions continue as darkness falls. Enemy direction-finding teams plot the bearings. Viet Cong forces maneuver through the night. By dawn, the patrol is surrounded. The evacuation becomes a full-scale battle. Additional casualties are sustained. In some cases, the entire patrol is overrun. The Australian doctrine was built on the understanding that short-term risk could prevent long-term catastrophe. Yes, maintaining radio silence meant wounded men had to wait for treatment. Yes, it meant patrols in contact couldn't immediately call for support. Yes, it meant hours of uncertainty for commanders who couldn't confirm their patrol status. But it also meant those patrols survived to reach first light. And survival was the ultimate operational success, the sound of nothing. The psychological weight of radio silence was perhaps the doctrine's most underappreciated burden. Human beings are social creatures. We find comfort in communication, in knowing that help is available, in hearing familiar voices that confirm we're not alone. For soldiers operating in hostile territory, the radio represents connection to safety, to support, to the institutional power that can be brought to bear if things go wrong. Silencing that radio was like cutting a lifeline. Australian SAS operators training for Vietnam underwent extensive psychological preparation for the isolation that radio silence would impose. They learned to operate for days at a time, without any communication with higher headquarters. They learned to make tactical decisions independently, without guidance or confirmation from command elements. They learned to trust in their training, their patrol members, and their own judgment, rather than relying on external support. This training separated Australian SAS operators from conventional soldiers in ways that went beyond tactical skills. Conventional warfare operates on the principle of integrated support. Infantry advances under artillery cover. Patrols maneuver knowing that air support is a radio call away. The individual soldier is part of a larger machine, and that machine's power compensates for individual limitations. Australian SAS doctrine inverted this entirely. The patrol was not part of a larger machine. The patrol was the machine, complete and self-contained. Everything needed to survive, evade, and accomplish the mission had to exist within that five-man element. There was no cavalry coming over the hill. There was no artillery fire mission that would arrive in 5 minutes. There was only what the patrol carried and what the patrol could do. The training to produce this level of operational independence was exhaustive and uncompromising. Before deploying to Vietnam, Australian SAS operators spent months in jungle training environments that replicated the conditions they would face in hostile territory. They conducted patrols lasting weeks without any communication with headquarters. They were inserted into remote areas with minimal supplies and required to navigate, survive, and complete reconnaissance objectives without external support. During these training exercises, radio silence was enforced with penalties that reinforced its importance. Trainees who broke radio silence without authorization faced immediate failure of the exercise and potential removal from the selection course. The message was unambiguous. If you cannot maintain radio discipline in training, you cannot be trusted to maintain it in combat, where lives depend on that discipline. The patrol signalers, who would carry and operate the radios, received specialized training that emphasized restraint over technical proficiency. They learned to compose messages that could be transmitted in under 10 seconds. They practiced rapid frequency changes that would make direction finding more difficult. They studied terrain masking and learned to identify transmission sites that offered maximum protection from enemy direction finding stations. But most importantly, they learned to resist the psychological pressure to transmit. In training scenarios, instructors would manufacture situations designed to create pressure for radio communication. Patrols would be given ambiguous intelligence. They would be placed in positions where the temptation to request clarification or guidance was strong. They would encounter unexpected complications that could theoretically justify breaking radio silence. The correct response, drilled into every operator, was to solve the problem without transmitting. Use your training. Use your judgment. Use the resources available within the patrol. The radio was not a decision-making tool. It was not a safety blanket. It was emergency equipment to be used only when all other options had been exhausted. This psychological conditioning was perhaps the most important element of the training. Technical skills could be taught relatively quickly. Radio procedures could be memorized. But the mental discipline to sit in darkness, surrounded by enemy forces, listening to your wounded patrol members' breathing, grow labored, and still maintain radio silence, that required a transformation in how operators thought about warfare, about support, about survival. Australian SAS operators learned that independence was not just operational necessity. It was tactical advantage. A patrol that relied on external support was a patrol that had weaknesses the enemy could exploit. A patrol that was self-sufficient was a patrol that could operate with absolute flexibility, adapting to circumstances without the constraints of coordination requirements or communication schedules. This operational independence produced a level of tactical proficiency that American observers found difficult to quantify. Australian patrols moved differently. They planned differently. They thought differently. When an American patrol encountered a problem, the instinct was to call for help. When an Australian patrol encountered a problem, the instinct was to solve it themselves, because calling for help meant compromising their position. This psychology extended to every aspect of patrol operations. Australian patrols selected routes that kept them beyond enemy artillery range whenever possible, because they couldn't rely on counter-battery fire for protection. They carried more ammunition than American patrols, because they couldn't request resupply. They established ambush positions with multiple egress routes planned and rehearsed, because they couldn't call for extraction if things went wrong. The radio sat in the patrol signaler's pack, fully functional and ready for emergency use, but essentially regarded as equipment of last resort. Its presence was comforting. Its silence was survival. Breaking the silence. The circumstances under which Australian SAS patrols would violate radio silence at night were specifically defined and ruthlessly limited. The doctrine recognized that absolute prohibition could occasionally be more dangerous than the risk of detection, but the threshold for breaking silence was set extraordinarily high. Immediate threat to life. If a patrol was in contact with enemy forces and immediate fire support was the only option that could prevent the patrol's annihilation, radio silence could be broken. But the definition of immediate threat was considerably more severe than American standards. Australian patrols were expected to attempt disengagement and evasion before requesting fire support. The transmission was authorized only when all other tactical options had been exhausted. Critical intelligence of immediate operational significance. If a patrol observed enemy activity that indicated an imminent large-scale attack on Allied forces, that information justified breaking radio silence. But the intelligence had to be time-sensitive and genuinely critical. Observation of normal enemy movement, even in significant numbers, did not meet the threshold. Medical emergency beyond the patrol's capability to manage. A wounded patrol member who would die without immediate hospital care justified breaking silence to request evacuation. But the standard was high. Serious wounds that the patrol medic could stabilize, even if they required eventual hospital treatment, did not meet the threshold until first light. Even when these conditions were met, the protocol for breaking silence was designed to minimize detection risk. Transmissions were kept to absolute minimum duration. No preliminary calls, no acknowledgement of receipt, just grid coordinates, essential information, and immediate radio silence resumed. The entire transmission window might be under 10 seconds. Patrol signalers trained extensively in rapid transmission techniques. They would pre-write messages, reducing complex tactical situations to the minimum number of words that could convey essential information. They would plan transmission sites that offered terrain masking from likely enemy direction-finding positions. They would use brief burst transmissions when equipment allowed, and after every transmission, the patrol would immediately relocate. The assumption was that the enemy had detected the transmission and plotted a bearing. The patrol's position was now compromised. Movement to a new position, at least 200 meters from the transmission site, was mandatory. The patrol would then remain stationary, listening for any indication that enemy forces were moving toward the compromised location. This protocol meant that even authorized transmissions carried significant tactical cost. The patrol would lose hours of movement time in their operational plan. They would have to relocate in darkness, always the most dangerous type of movement. They would potentially compromise their mission by revealing their general area of operations. American liaison officers who observed Australian operations often struggled to understand why the Australians tolerated these costs. From an American perspective, the radio was a tool. You used it when you needed it. Worrying about enemy direction finding seemed paranoid when American forces had overwhelming fire support available. But the statistics told a different story. Australian patrols completed their missions and returned to base. American patrols transmitted freely and died in ambushes that always seemed to be positioned perfectly to intercept them. The verification. In early 1970, General Crichton Abrams, commander of Military Assistance Command Vietnam, was finally briefed on conclusive evidence that North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces had been exploiting American radio communications throughout the war. His response, recorded in classified documents, was reportedly volcanic. "This is terrible. They are reading our mail, and it has to stop. Get the word out to every division and corps commander." But the damage was already done. Thousands of American soldiers had died in ambushes that might have been prevented if radio discipline had been enforced. Countless operations had been compromised because enemy forces knew Allied positions, strength, and intentions through intercepted communications. American military intelligence agencies conducted extensive analysis of captured enemy documents and interrogation reports from prisoners. What they discovered confirmed Australian warnings that had been dismissed for years. Enemy forces maintained detailed files on American unit radio procedures. They knew that American patrols typically transmitted position reports every 2 hours. They knew that medical emergencies generated predictable patterns of radio traffic. They knew that American commanders required regular check-ins from patrols, and that the absence of a scheduled check-in would trigger search operations. Most damning, they had developed specific tactical drills for exploiting American radio communications. When enemy direction-finding teams detected an American patrol's transmission, that information would be immediately relayed to local combat units. Those units would establish ambush positions along likely routes of movement. They would wait, sometimes for hours, monitoring for additional transmissions that would confirm the patrol was moving into the killing zone. The evidence also revealed why enemy forces avoided contact with Australian patrols. Captured documents explicitly stated that Australian units could not be reliably located through direction finding because their radio discipline made detection impossible. Enemy forces that attempted to ambush Australian patrols, based on the rare transmissions they did make, found that the Australians had already relocated by the time combat units arrived at the fixed position. One captured Viet Cong intelligence report, translated by American analysts, described Australian SAS patrols as invisible to radio reconnaissance methods. The report recommended that local forces should not attempt to locate Australian patrols through direction finding and should instead rely on physical tracking, though it noted that Australian counter-tracking techniques made this extremely difficult as well. The operational implications were stark. Australian SAS patrols operating in the same areas as American forces achieved kill ratios that exceeded American performance by orders of magnitude while sustaining dramatically lower casualties. A significant factor in this disparity was simply that the enemy couldn't find the Australians, the adaptation that never came. Following General Abrams' directive in 1970, American forces implemented new communication security procedures. Units were instructed to minimize radio transmissions. Call signs and frequencies were changed more regularly. Brevity codes were introduced to reduce transmission duration. Training emphasized the threat of enemy direction-finding capabilities, but institutional change in military organizations is slow, particularly when that change contradicts decades of doctrinal development. American communications procedures had been built around the assumption that radio security could be maintained through technical means: encryption, frequency hopping, signal processing. The idea that the solution might be to simply not transmit was philosophically incompatible with American operational methods. American doctrine emphasized integration and coordination. Company commanders needed to know where their platoons were. Battalion commanders needed regular status updates from companies. Fire support coordination required continuous communication between forward observers and artillery units. Medical evacuation procedures were built around immediate notification and rapid response. The entire system was designed around the assumption that reliable, continuous radio communications were not just available, but necessary. Asking American forces to adopt Australian-style radio silence was like asking them to fight with one hand tied behind their backs. Yes, it reduced the risk of detection, but it also reduced operational coordination, slowed decision-making, and eliminated the responsive fire support that was the foundation of American tactical superiority. The Australian approach worked for Australian forces because their entire operational method was built around it. Australian patrols were small, independent, and trained to operate without external support. They didn't need regular check-ins because their commanders trusted them to accomplish their missions and return. They didn't need continuous fire support coordination because they avoided contact when possible and were trained to fight their way out independently when contact was unavoidable. American forces operating in larger units with different missions and different tactical approaches couldn't simply adopt Australian radio procedures without restructuring their entire operational method. The institutional investment in existing procedures was too deep. The training was too ingrained. The commanders who had built their careers on one approach were not going to suddenly embrace a radically different philosophy based on the example of a small Allied force whose methods they didn't fully understand. And so, American forces continued transmitting. The new procedures reduced the volume of radio traffic and improved some security practices, but they didn't fundamentally change the reality that American patrols were significantly more detectable than their Australian counterparts. The casualty figures reflected this reality through the end of American combat operations in Vietnam. The legacy, when Australian SAS squadrons completed their final tours in Vietnam in 1971, they left behind a combat record that military historians would study for decades. Nearly 1,200 patrols conducted, over 492 enemy killed confirmed, with potentially hundreds more unconfirmed. 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 accidentally killed, 1 missing, 1 death from illness, 28 wounded. These numbers were not achieved through superior weapons, advanced technology, or overwhelming force. They were achieved through discipline, fieldcraft, and the understanding that survival in hostile territory required operating by different rules than conventional warfare. Radio discipline was not the only factor in Australian SAS success. Their slow movement techniques, scent elimination, counter-tracking methods, and psychological operations all contributed to their effectiveness. But radio discipline was the foundation upon which everything else was built, because a patrol that the enemy could detect through their radio transmissions would never have the opportunity to demonstrate their other tactical skills. They would be dead in an ambush before those skills mattered. The lessons learned in Vietnam about radio discipline remain relevant to modern special operations forces. The technology has changed. Modern radios use frequency hopping, burst transmission, and sophisticated encryption that make direction finding significantly more difficult. But the fundamental principle remains unchanged. Every transmission is a potential compromise, and the best transmission is often no transmission at all. Contemporary special operations units train extensively in minimizing their electronic signature. They use strict communication windows, pre-planned transmission schedules, and backup non-electronic communication methods. They understand that even encrypted transmissions can be detected, that even secure radios generate signals that sophisticated adversaries can exploit for targeting. The Australian SAS doctrine from Vietnam anticipated modern electronic warfare by decades. They understood that technology alone could not ensure communication security. That discipline, training, and operational procedures were more important than any equipment. That sometimes the most advanced tactic was to simply not engage in behaviors that could be exploited. The night belongs to ghosts. There's a story, probably apocryphal but repeated so often among Vietnam veterans, that it's achieved the status of legend, about an American patrol that was pinned down at night in 1969. They had made contact just before sunset. The firefight had been brief but intense. 2 men wounded. The patrol commander had called for emergency evacuation, but the helicopters couldn't come in until first light because of enemy anti-aircraft positions in the area, so the patrol hunkered down, and the radio operator kept transmitting. Status updates every 15 minutes, casualty condition reports, requests for fire support, all the standard procedures that American doctrine prescribed for a patrol in contact. And somewhere in the darkness, enemy forces were moving into position, guided by direction-finding bearings that were updated every time the radio operator keyed his handset. The legend says that an Australian SAS patrol was operating in the same general area. They heard the American radio traffic. They heard the increasing desperation in the transmissions as the night wore on, and they understood exactly what was happening. The Australian patrol moved toward the American position, using the darkness and their silent movement techniques to pass through the enemy forces that were maneuvering for the kill. They reached a position 50 meters from the surrounded Americans and established a defensive perimeter. And then they waited, in absolute silence, while the American radio operator continued transmitting, completely unaware that help had arrived, completely unaware that his transmissions were drawing enemy forces into an ambush where the Australians waited. At first light, when the enemy launched what they believed would be an overwhelming assault on an isolated, wounded American patrol, they walked directly into a coordinated defense. The Australians engaged from concealed positions, their modified weapons cutting through the attacking force with devastating effect. The ambush collapsed within seconds. The enemy withdrew, leaving behind dead and wounded. The American patrol was extracted successfully. The wounded troopers survived, and the radio operator supposedly never transmitted unnecessarily again. Whether this specific incident happened or not is uncertain, but the pattern it represents was repeated throughout the war. American patrols that transmitted freely found themselves ambushed by enemy forces that seemed to know exactly where they were. Australian patrols that maintained radio silence operated with near impunity in the same areas. The difference was discipline. The discipline to sit in the darkness and trust your training. The discipline to operate independently without the comfort of constant communication. The discipline to understand that sometimes survival requires doing nothing, saying nothing, and becoming invisible to an enemy that is listening for any sign of your presence. The final transmission, in October 1971, the last Australian SAS patrol crossed the wire at Nui Dat and prepared to board the helicopters that would take them home. 6 years of operations in Vietnam were ending. Nearly 600 men had served in the regiment's squadrons, and the vast majority of them were boarding those helicopters alive, carrying with them the memory of a war fought on their own terms, in their own way. The radio in the patrol signaler's pack had served faithfully throughout their tour. It had been tested regularly, maintained carefully, carried on every patrol, and used as sparingly as circumstances allowed, because that restraint had kept them alive. As the helicopter lifted off, the signaler looked at his radio one last time. In all the patrols he had conducted, in all the nights spent in hostile jungle, he had broken radio silence exactly 3 times. Once to report a significant enemy force concentration that led to a successful air strike. Once to call for emergency medical evacuation for a patrol member with a compound fracture. Once to coordinate an extraction when his patrol was compromised by accidental contact with a local civilian. 3 transmissions, 3 nights spent in hostile territory where that radio remained silent despite his instinct to check in, to confirm his patrol status, to hear a familiar voice from headquarters. 3 nights that he and his patrol members survived because the enemy couldn't find them. The final numbers would be calculated by military analysts and historians. The kill ratios, the casualty figures, the mission success rates. But for the men who actually walked those patrols, who actually lived the doctrine, who actually maintained that discipline night after night in the darkness, the numbers didn't matter. What mattered was that they came home, that the enemy couldn't find them because they had become ghosts, true phantoms of the jungle who moved in silence, struck without warning, and disappeared without trace. And the radio that sat silent in the darkness was not a limitation or a handicap. It was the reason they survived to tell the story. The Viet Cong had a saying about Australian SAS patrols, rung, the jungle ghosts. They called them this because they appeared from nowhere, killed with precision, and vanished without leaving any trail that could be followed. But the most ghostly thing about them, the thing that frightened enemy forces more than their marksmanship or their fieldcraft, was their silence. Because you cannot ambush what you cannot find. You cannot locate what does not transmit. You cannot kill what has become invisible to every method you possess for detecting enemy forces. The Australians understood this from the first patrol to the last. Every night in hostile territory was a test of discipline. Every hour of silence was survival purchased at the cost of comfort. Every avoided transmission was a conscious choice to trust in training, to rely on patrol members, to operate independently in an environment where the enemy owned the darkness. And when the war ended and the analysts compiled their reports, when the historians examined the record and tried to understand how one small Allied force achieved results that far exceeded larger, better-equipped American units, the answer was there in the radio logs, or more precisely, in the absence of radio logs, in the long stretches of silence that marked Australian operations, in the discipline that kept patrols alive when every instinct screamed to key the handset and call for help. No radios after dark. It was a simple rule, a counterintuitive doctrine, a discipline that seemed to deny soldiers the very support systems that modern warfare was built around. But it worked, and for the men who lived it, who survived because of it, who came home because they had learned to become ghosts in the darkness, it was the most important lesson Vietnam had to teach. Silence is survival. The enemy cannot kill what the enemy cannot find. And sometimes the most powerful weapon is the transmission you don't make. The radio sits in a museum now, preserved alongside other equipment from Australia's Vietnam War operations. It still works. The battery has been replaced, but the transceiver, the handset, the antenna, all original. A small placard explains its significance. A N/PRC-25 radio used by Australian SAS patrols in Vietnam, 1966 to 1971. What the placard doesn't say, what can't be adequately explained in a museum display, is that this radio's most important function was remaining silent. That the men who carried it into hostile jungle understood that their survival depended not on how well it transmitted, but on how rarely it did. That discipline, that understanding, that willingness to operate in darkness and isolation, that was the real weapon. The radio was just equipment. The silence was survival. And the ghosts who learned that lesson walked out of the jungle alive,